Okay, time starts now. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to talk. I feel like I'm the fourth token economist in a row here, but maybe the first on this panel. He will kindly address some of the questions in my introduction. I'll use the term benefits. I see that as just the opposite of the cost of inaction, but I find it clarifying because there's also cost of action, and I want to look at the comparison between the two, which I think in some abstract sense, benefit-cost ratios may be, in a social sense, effective guides for policies, and certainly in terms of dealing with ministers of finance, they're likely to be very, very useful constructs. On both, there's life cycle perspectives. Overriding all of this are a question of what policy motives might be. Economists think of policy motives on one hand as relating to efficiency, productivity. We've heard some discussion of that by the previous three tokens. In that case, the efficiency dimension of it is if there's differentials between private and social incentives. There's, in addition, a distributional question. Probably for most people in the room, this relates somehow to the people, the poorest people in society, being concerned about those living in poverty. A dimension of that, which in a way Ziva will talk about next, would be viewing certain elements of child development as rights, and then the question is, well, how do you want to incorporate that in the sort of thing what I'm talking about? And I would argue you could put distributional weights, you could put very heavy weight on improvements in children who are very low in the distributions in order to incorporate that. So in principle, one could do that. And turning to benefits, I've already made these points, except for the middle one, that benefits are likely to be multiple. They're likely to be multiple, improved health, averted mortality, resources saved, increased productivity. And so to summarize them, there's a challenge if one wants to get at one measure of, perhaps one way of approaching the measure of potential that Peter mentioned in his earlier comments. To summarize them, one has to weight these different things. How do you add a 0.1 probability reducing mortality with the resources saved from reducing early life morbidity with the added productivity that is gained later in life? That is a challenge. Some of these are very difficult to decide how you put weights on. I think for me, I think for many people, what is most difficult is averted mortality. But if one's going to combine these things together, then some weights are needed. This is just a life cycle kind of schematic. I think there's no reason to spend more than about 10 seconds on this. Hero said I could have up to 40, but maybe that was two other slides too. The point is we're talking about life cycle. We're talking about a holistic approach, including multiple dimensions of child development, physical development, cognitive development, social, emotional development, executive function. And those are likely to be started early in the life and have impact on what happens thereafter. And the kinds of returns to investments later are likely to depend on the investments earlier, as Paul said in some of his comments. There's certainly estimates of associations between dimensions of early life and outcomes over the life cycle. Here is an example from the Lancet paper by Victoria et al. Of associations between infant anthropometric measures and subsequent outcomes over the life cycle. Here's an example from the Engle et al. Lancet papers in 2007 and 2011 of impact on cognitive skills, impacts on the order of magnitude 0.3 standard deviation. These are cognitive skills measured when the children are still fairly young, either of preschool age or in their early school years. The question, of course, is how these persist or are amplified later in the life cycle. But there's a lot of literature about these kind of associations. Before turning to one example of trying to combine them, I want to make 2 points. First is that the benefits depend upon survival. I mean, survival still comes into the story, not just infant survival. And secondly, to think about benefits that are occurring in the future, such as when people become adults and arguably are more productive or don't have chronic diseases, one has to worry about discounting those benefits to present terms. And the reason I would argue you have to worry about that is if you get a benefit of $1,000 today, you can reinvest it and tomorrow or next year have $1,030 or $1,040 or $1,100. If you get that same $1,000 20 years down the road, then in those 20 years in between, you're not able to reinvest and get the returns from the investment. And it makes a difference. Here in this table are for 3%, 6%, and 10% discount rates, what $1,000 is worth in the present if you receive it 10, 40, 60 years in the future. So at a 6% discount rate, intermediate one, receiving $1,000 in 40 years is worth receiving $97 now. There's a big difference in having to wait 40 years to generate returns on the investment. Survival rates make some difference. This is using life tables for India. It reduces the benefits to about 0.8 of what they would have been for benefits which occur late in life and should be incorporated, but the discounting is likely to be the more critical factor. Now, here are some estimates that Harold Alderman and I did about the present discounted value using discount rates of 3, 5, and 10% of 7 major impacts of moving one infant out of low birth weight status to above low birth weight status in a low-income country using the best estimates that we could find to piece this together over the life cycle. I guess the first point, if we take the intermediate, the 5%, the value of doing so is something like $510, but notice how this is much larger if, say, a 3% discount rate is appropriate, or much smaller if a 10% rate is appropriate. Second, given the assumptions we made to weight these various outcomes, the biggest present discounted value of gains come from various kinds of productivity gains, 4 and 5, which have to do with productivity gains when these infants become 20 to 60. Even though we're discounting, so these are discount back to the present, those are big gains. They're big gains because they last over many years. Third, the critical question I said before is how you value reduced infant mortality. If you put, and there's a lot of disagreement about that, if that is valued highly enough, that will become the dominant gain. Other points important, I think, is that these benefits are likely to be heterogeneous across various contexts. The benefits, the fourth point, are likely to be conditional upon what the prevalence of situation is in the start. And in all this, there's considerable uncertainties. turning to cost, the point about cost is when we're talking about cost here, we're talking about resource cost, people's time using materials. We're not talking about the expenditures of providers. For many purposes, that's not a big deal. But one important example that Leah was talking about yesterday is, it is a big deal, and that is conditional cash transfer programs are basically primarily transferring resources from one person to another. That entails some resource costs. It takes someone to run the program. It takes, some goods, et cetera, but it's nothing like the measure of the expenditures themselves. From a societal point of view, it's the resource costs that count, not those expenditures. Additional points are that resource costs include private costs. Some people tend to just look at the expenditures of providers, often governments, maybe NGOs, and say those are the costs. To me, that's sort of amazing, almost immoral, because usually these programs impose significant costs on some of the clients, in particular, usually poor women. To ignore those seems not only inappropriate as an economist, but as I say, almost immoral. Costs also are going to vary over the life cycle. They also are going to raise this question of discounting. Those points are similar. Because of time, I'm going to run quickly. Here's an example of some costs for dealing with acute malnutrition that Levin and Brouwer put together as part of a Grand Challenges Canada project in which we're engaged. The only point I want to make here is these and costs for almost any such thing vary a lot as you look across countries, in part because of different ways of dealing in different countries. But the ultimate point is the context is going to matter as you look across countries. So I'm now going to turn to some benefit cost estimates. I'm going to look at these 4 different groups. The first is from the Copenhagen Consensus, and there are costs here of various ways for dealing with nutritional interventions or nutritional deficiencies for children under 5, reducing low birth weight, reducing infant and child nutrition, reducing micronutrient deficiencies. The point I would make is these benefit to cost ratios vary a lot across these various interventions. These are ones that are selected because they were particularly promising, firstly. Secondly, for a particular intervention, the range is fairly large, depending upon what decisions you make about discount rates and other components. Thirdly, the range of these benefit to cost ratios is huge, but many of them are substantially greater than one, suggesting these are interventions worth undertaking. I'm going to summarize briefly from the Engle et al. Lancet 2011 estimates some measures of the benefits from closing gaps in preschooling enrollment. The basic idea is what would happen if you close the gap between the top quintile and the other quintile, or at least partially close such gaps. And that's reflected then in the relatively schooling enrollment across the distribution, which is reflected ultimately in productivity or earnings. This just shows the range between the schooling gap and the pre-primary schooling enrollment rate, which I don't know, Leah probably made, but reflects, there's a lot of variation, but a systematic association between the two. And putting this information together, we get an estimated increase in future earnings on the order of magnitude of 11 to 30 some billion dollars, with benefit to cost ratios from 6.4 to 17.1. In some ways, this is a conservative estimate. Here's some benefit cost ratios for moving a child from stunting to not stunted in different countries. This is actually, I hope this keeps me fuzz, based on some work that Mutta et al. Did, as well as some work we had done. And the point here is these benefit cost ratios, A, tend to be large, and B, vary a lot across countries given the different contexts. Finally, here's some different estimates for Uganda benefit cost ratios. And the only point here is we have a base case with the estimate 1.6. That's worth doing, but it's very sensitive to various assumptions we're making. If we make all the assumptions, get to this optimistic assumption, we get 8.6, we get much larger. If we change the discount rate to 10%, it's much smaller. So conclusions, I think apparently there's high benefit cost ratios, although there's a lot of uncertainty in this, a lot of heterogeneity. Most of these studies were focusing on poor children, but it might be if you put emphasis on rights, you would weight the poorer children among these poor children even more. They don't say anything about guidance on efficiency, productivity, but that's probably, let me just leave it at that. And the last point is they're context specific, which I think is important in terms of this panel because Constancia is going to talk about a very particular context, I think, in Colombia. And then Quentin's going to talk about SABRE, which attempts to look at various contexts. And I want to illustrate that point in the last two slides by taking this illustration, which I actually find a somewhat bothersome illustration. J-POW is the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, and this is from their website. And this is intended as guidance for what you get per buck. What do you get? How many extra years of primary schooling do you get if you spend $100? And the range is huge, from about 20 years to 0.03 years, looking at different interventions, providing information, deworming, conditional cash transfers for primary enrollment in Mexico. And the apparent intent is to provide guidance for some minister of education or finance, say in Bolivia or Chad, about what interventions look most promising. I have lots of difficulties with this, one being the one I mentioned before, about conditional cash transfers and confusing transfers and costs, another, none of the private costs. But for me, what I find, I guess, strangest and most distressing is completely ignoring the context. So ask yourself this question. These are the 4 countries covered. Which of these 4 countries are you going to have the least impact on primary schooling enrollment? I mean, it has to depend upon where you start. If you start with 97% primary enrollment rates, you're not going to have much impact. Is that a surprise? Does that take an MIT economist? In terms of honest disclosure, I should say I have a PhD in economics from MIT. Thank you very much.
We'll go in the order on the program. So Ziba. Thank you, Jere.